Hey guys, welcome to this Rimworld guide. In this guide I'll be going over the starting up period when you've just landed and you kind of want to give yourself a good opportunity to survive the early game without any massive issues. That being said, the storyteller could still punish you, but at the very least you'll be prepared for the majority of the worst things that can happen in the early game. Just to let you know, I'm playing on a Temperate Forest Large Hill map on Crash Landed against Cassandra Classic on Adventure Story, and that is the settings that I recommend you start out with, especially on your first playthrough or two, just to give you the best understanding of how the game works while making it difficult enough to make it a bit of a challenge while not making it too difficult that you lose instantly. Although saying that, all of these tips and ideas and concepts that I'm going to be introducing in this guide, you'll be able to apply to any map tile and any playthrough. You just may need to min-max some of the aspects a little bit more. Let's jump into this game and I will explain what I'm going to be doing in this early game. So first of all, I let my colonists land, I let them pop out of their crash landed pods, and I pause it straight away. And the reason I pause it right away is to orientate myself, find out what I have available. So you'll eventually learn what comes with the crash landed. It does tell you at the beginning, but you may not have memorized it all, to do some setup before we even let the game play, because there are about 5 days to potentially considerably more depending on what storyteller you're playing against, but there are 5 days minimum before your first raid may occur. And in those 5 days you want to do as much as you can that you possibly can to make sure that you're giving yourself a good chance to survive those early bad things that may happen. If you let it play, your colonists will start eating food and wandering away, and they won't be doing anything useful. Your best bet is to get a bunch of stuff set up, get them some tasks ready for them to do, and make the most of this time as possible. So the first thing I recommend you do is go into your orders down in your architect and click allow and drag and select all of these items nearby to allow them. And the reason you do this is because that little cross means that it won't be usable by a colonist unless you give them explicit permission, so you have to micromanage every move. So I then also go around, there are some random items across the map, so I kind of go around and just do this as huge swaves of allowing. Next thing to do when you've got it paused is go to your work priorities, so you can set up who's going to be doing what and how important they should consider that task. I always turn on manual priorities, and I've just noticed I have someone who cannot firefight, and I just want to find out if that means I've selected a person that is pyromaniac or if they just cannot. Okay, this guy just won't firefight. That's okay, it's not a problem. If it was a pyromaniac, I would probably be considering starting this run again, but as it's not, I'm going to select firefight, hold down shift and bring it up to a 1, because you always want as many colonists as you can firefighting if you ever have a fire. It is uber important. Select my patient to 1, and I have 2 doctors in this case. Both of them are pretty damn good as well, so I'm going to set them both to 1, and the reason why I'm going to do this is because I want them both to heal each other if they ever need to, as well as obviously tend to other colonists when needed. And that's because if you do self-tend for a doctor, it's only 70% efficiency, so if they can do it to one another, it will make it much better. Bed rest I tend to leave to a 3 unless there's a serious injury or someone has a disease. If someone has a disease, there's basically 2 percentages that tick up: the disease percentage and immunity percentage. You need your immunity percentage to hit 100% before the disease does, otherwise your colonist dies. Actually, just a little tip: if the immunity and disease hit it at 100 at the same time, technically the disease has to tick up to 100.9, I believe, and you just don't see the 0.9 tick up, and it's 100.9 that your colonist will die. So if you can kind of like equal level it. If your colonist is set to bed rest, they will go to a bed, and when they are in a bed, they will actually gain immunity faster than if they were walking around, or in a better quality beds will also give them better immunity. So when they have a disease, I always set them to bed rest until the immunity percentage has massively outpaced the disease percentage, but otherwise I leave it as a 3, because otherwise they could get like a scratch and then they go to bed for like 3 days and don't do anything. Basic I sometimes like to set to a 1. It kind of depends on your playstyle. In the early game I like to set it to a 1 because I have like bits and pieces that I'll micromanage, like my power grid, and I'll want people to switch stuff on and off as soon as I tell them to. Warden I always set someone to 1. That's because in the past I have accidentally forgotten to set anyone to warden to any degree of priority, and have accidentally let prisoners basically get to a starving point and riot and cause issues. So I always set someone to 1. It basically doesn't affect anything until you get someone that they can actually warden to. When I get from warden onwards, I tend to set things only to a 2. That way I can set, say for example, this person 2 for cook, 2 for construct, and then everything else is 3 because I don't really consider them important. But let's say I want him to stop cooking and start constructing for a bit, I'll select construct to a 1 and then back down to cooking, and he'll cook until cooking is done, and then he'll go into construction tasks. Now in this case, I'm also going to set this other person to construct because it's good to have a lot of things built in the early game. And then actually going to set this guy to a 3 because construction is more important. And we also have a second cook. I'm going to get this guy to cook, hunt, grow, plant cart, leave mining a little bit lower because again we have quite a lot of material, so we don't need it early game. And that will basically do for my early setup. I will also set these two to research, but not massively importantly. Neither of them are only capable of research, and I have more important things to do right at the beginning that I would like them to do for research. Next things we have is schedule. I personally like this kind of method where I give them 2 hours of recreation before they sleep. That means they usually come back to the base area when they're about to recreate. So they recreate and then they go to bed and they don't have to walk very far. And then that way they always top up their recreation. They usually do it together so they get some social aspect. And just as a quick thing to double check, if you have any colonist with night owl, which I don't think I do, nope. If you have any colonists with night owl, they will want to sleep between, I think it's 11 and 6. So make sure you set them to sleep between 11 and 6. It will give them a mood boost and stop them from being grumpy because they aren't sleeping during the day. But in my case, that's not the case, so I like to set them to sleep for about 5 hours, give them anything if, for 6 to 8, so if they need to sleep a little bit longer, get some food, do some recreation, they can, then get them to work for 9 to 6. Some people like to increase this working period for the start and push through some of the issues that can cause because it gives you much more efficiency. You may need to min-max it in harder tiles, but in our particular setup, I think this is the best way to avoid early mental breaks. The next thing is managing the medicine. I don't want them using our industrial meds right away. These are quite precious resources to us. We can't make them yet. They're relatively expensive to buy and we'll have to find traders to purchase it from. So I save them for emergencies, and same where if I ever got Glitterworld meds, which is the next set of meds up from this, which you can't even make, you can only purchase, I would not want to use them except for in emergencies, and this allows them currently. So I'd make sure everyone is set to herbal medicine only. I would also then set my doctors, who I believe are Lucy and Davila. I would set both of them to carry herbal meds. At the moment we don't have any herbal meds, so they will just do doctor tending without any medicine, but as soon as we can grow and or pick some herbal meds or even purchase some, we will get them to use that. The next thing I like to do, and this is specific to Crash Landed, so if you're not playing on Crash Landed it's less important, these 3 items here are flak armor. And they're kind of like almost considered, I'd say, late early game or early mid game items. It's pretty far along before you can make them. They use quite a lot of resources and it's not really a top priority usually in my playthroughs to build flak armor. So I kind of treat these as kind of precious resources, and so I don't want my colonists to wear them. So I come into a current outfit. I leave it as anything. I don't really manage these until later on, but I come in and I turn off all the flak stuff so they don't use the flak items to begin with, just so I can keep them for when they're needed. So if I've got a big raid coming, I'll probably give it to whichever my colonist I believe I would like protected the most, or I may even split them up across multiple colonists to protect various parts of them. I leave food restriction as lavish because early game you just have these packaged survival meals, and until we get some sort of food supply chain going, I tend to leave it as lavish, so just leave it with, it literally has everything selected. And then once I have a sort of food setup going, I'll set it usually such that they won't eat these packaged survival meals and they'll just eat maybe simple meals unless I give them permission to eat a fine meal and stuff like that. But to start with, I leave them alone. I leave the drug policies alone right at the early game, again because you don't really have any drugs, so you don't need to worry about it. The next thing is figuring out the best place for a base. Oh, and just one more thing on the medicine side of things. If you come into a colonist, go to health and click on defaults, you can say that any new colonist that joins you will automatically go to herbal meds, and you can obviously change that later on if you wanted to adjust it. But yes, the next thing is to look for the best place for a base. Now there's a few things I look up when setting up a base. One of them is grow zones. So you see this little button down here, you can see that this dark green is, if I hover over it in the bottom left, you can see down in here it will say rich soil, 140% fertility. That's really good for growing food in the early game, so it's usually good to have some nearby. The other thing to consider is, can I use some of the mountain as my first sort of area to kind of guard myself against? Is there like a nice enclosed space that I can maybe use partially? Having ruins nearby is good. You maybe don't want to set up within the ruins, but having them nearby so you can pillage some of the materials is also handy. And usually ruins will also contain tables, so unfortunately we don't have any tables near to us, but that's okay. So I like to look for ruins. I also like to look for steam geysers, these things here. And if you zoom out and double click on an item, it will select all the nearest. So unfortunately we have nothing like super near us except for at the edge. I also recommend sticking not too close to the edge because there is a build position limit. So if you go into structure and select a structure, you can see I cannot build over that line. So I like to not be too near the edge. I'm actually thinking that where we landed isn't the worst spot. I might be able to build around this little like L-shaped mountain here, or even up in this one actually might be where I start. I can connect these mountains later and kind of use them as my wall. It's a little bit open over here, so I'll have to use a lot of resources to wall it off. Or I could even wall myself in over here and slightly move myself over. I have plenty of fertile grow space. And some good like ruins nearby I can use for some resources. So for me, this is kind of where I would set things up. Your map will be different. It could vary drastically, especially if you're not on a temperate forest. You may have other issues with lots of trees or not many trees at all. The next thing I like to do is kind of give myself a rough base outline. Now I'm going to use this kind of fact that we have several walls around us here. I know it's not going to be a permanent base, but what I tend to do is I'll come in, I'll go to my orders and I'll click on plan, and I'll give myself like something like this. I'll remove that in a bit, but this basically says to me, okay, I'm going to build here, and then this is going to become my starting base. And just going to check, if I go to here, we can see there's no overhead mountain or mountainous roof over these things here, so I can actually mine them out so I can make this slightly larger to start out. Now I know roughly where I want to put my starting base. What I will then do is I will set up some zones. So the reason I set up some zones is so that wherever we landed, they will bring over those materials. But I also set up two zones, one for items that will deteriorate if outside. So I call it like indoor stockpile or indoor stock. And then another zone for stuff that doesn't deteriorate, so I'll just pop it outside, and that's mainly in the early game. That's steel, but other things include stone that you can get from breaking down buildings or get from stone cutting. It's also things like plasteel, uranium, I believe gold and silver don't deteriorate, but they're not good to keep outside, because the other reason I don't keep you eventually will build stuff around this eventually, most likely, is because if you keep anything outside, raiders can come along, grab it and run. They maybe won't even stick around. So yeah, that's setting up some basic stockpiles. I know roughly where my base is going to be. I can see that I'm probably going to come over here and break down. These are steel walls, so I'm probably going to start my base out of steel. I would recommend starting your base as much as you can out of stone, but unfortunately I don't have a lot of stone nearby, and I don't want to start stone cutting right away because it takes a bit of time. It's something I will definitely start early, but I wouldn't start it right away. So removing floors, you get some resources back, and by deconstructing walls, I'll also get some resources. But as I can see that I'm really not going to get much other than steel from these structures, I'm likely just going to build everything out of wood to start with, because wood is a slightly less precious resource. It is flammable, but so is steel, so it's not ideal, but it gives you a good starting point so you can get somewhere for your colonists to sleep inside. So I will actually build this outline so we can kind of see where they're going to build. And then finally, the last thing I do before I unpause the game and allow them to go and do stuff is I will check out who is my best shot, who turns out to be Gomihito. I don't know what his name is. Anyway, this guy is going to be my bolt action rifle because it's the best gun I have. This guy is incapable of violence, and this person is definitely a better meleeist, but guns are pretty OP in the early game. But I am going to actually, in this case, because they are zero shooting, give them the melee weapon, and then I'm going to let it play. So these guys are now going to drag stuff up here, and they're going to start building and start getting on with stuff. So while they get on with that sort of first task of hauling those items up there and building, next thing that I would suggest getting set up is some food growing. Now we found that this was fertile. We also have some fertile here, and we even have some in here apparently, so we're actually going to build over some fertile. I would say that this is probably the closest bit of fertile, and that I'm going to set up an entire grow zone, and in this case I'm going to pretty much cover this entire bottom section. Now I believe it's about 20 tiles of fertile soil of rice will 100% unlimitedly feed a colonist. However, you can get a negative thing that happens called a blight, which will just destroy your rice crop, so it's usually better to go more than that. And also you can supplement it with hunting. So you may want to have a look at wildlife and pick the biggest thing that doesn't have the chance of attacking back. Now I could hunt these muffalo because their chances of attacking back are quite low, and my guy with the rifle is actually quite a good shot. However, I'd still be risking potentially setting off an entire herd charging at me. So the best bet is probably to go for gazelle because they're pretty big. And if you're wondering like how to tell how much meat, you can press this eye here and I can see that this will give me 98 meat. Now you need 10 meat for a meal, so that will produce 9 meals from one gazelle if you get 100% yield. Now various things affect yield, but the main thing that in the early game that will affect yield is if you use a butcher spot, you only get 70% yield from a butchering, and if you choose a butcher table, you'll get 95. So I'm going to choose a butcher table, and in this case I'm going to put it outside, and that's just going to start so I have that ready for when I need it. I also need something to cook on. Now you have two choices: fueled, which requires wood, which is again a kind of finite resource to some extent. You can grow more trees and you can purchase wood, but it's not renewable in any sense. Or electric, and electric you can use renewable resources for. Now depending on how early you want to set up your power grid and how quickly you want to be able to have to defend and deal with a power grid depends on your choice here. In this case I'm looking at what we have around us and what we've got going on, and I'd say we're in a pretty good spot. So I'm going to actually start with an electric stove. So before I even build the electric stove, because we don't need to start cooking because we don't have any rice grown yet and we don't have any meat going off, I'm going to probably build myself a wind turbine. Now wind turbine needs to be without trees, so if I build it here, this rock is going to be in the way, any roofing will be in the way. So if I put it right here, it's actually without any problems around it, and then I can run some power line from it and into my base. Bearing in mind, wind turbines are based on just the whim of the wind. So if there's no wind, you won't have any power, so you may not be able to cook. So just bear that in mind. A good thing to get in the early game when you research is going to be batteries, so you can store some of that electricity. Now we've got a bit of food growing, a way of butchering creatures. If we start getting low on food, we can just go and hunt, or even if we're not getting low on food, we can hunt. I'm going to create an electric stove. And then another good thing to get really early game is a research bench. And that's so you can research stuff basically. And while we're in here and we're building stuff and getting our shelter up, I definitely recommend getting some beds as soon as you can, but you can start out by just setting up some sleeping spots just so your colonists know to go and sleep in this indoor space, which so if you hover in and out down here, it'll tell you if it's indoors, outdoors, and the temperature of that particular space. And the next thing that I recommend, because we're not going to get a raid this early on, the next thing I recommend kind of just getting set up very quickly is a horseshoe pin. And the reason I recommend that is because this is an awesome item. It's actually OP, and the reason it's OP is because you can build it, and for your first year you could literally not have to worry about recreation. Now I would recommend getting other recreation things, and you can see now I have my power grid going, but for starters that's all you really need. Now that this is built, I can now show you bills. So when a animal is killed, I want them to bring it over, so I'm going to create a dumping zone and call it butchery. In my storage, I'm going to go down and I'm going to turn off chunks, and I'm only going to allow animal corpses. That means they'll bring any fresh kills to here. You can also make sure that they don't bring rotten, so I'm going to turn off rotten, so only fresh corpses of animals will be brought here. When they're brought here, one, they're outside, so they will deteriorate because they're outside, but also if they're above 0 degrees, they will turn rotten. And we're at 13 degrees, so they'll turn rotten relatively quickly, usually within a few days of the kill. So we'll want to turn it into meat. Now when you turn it into meat, it almost resets the rotting. Well, it does 100% reset it, but meat has its own like rotting calculation. And again, depending on the temperature, depends how fast that meat will rot. And that can be, anywhere between, again, another 3 to 10 days if you're at 1 degree Celsius. If you're at 0 or lower, it will be frozen, and therefore it will never go off and you never have to worry about it. So eventually you'll want to set up a freezer so you can freeze stuff so it never goes off. Rice has a rotting rate as well, but theirs is closer to 40 days, so you don't have to worry about it so quickly. But yes, for butchering, we want them to basically butcher the creature I like to do forever straight away, and then I don't have to micromanage it. Some people micromanage it so that if they're really strapped for food, they'll give themselves down to the last hour or the last day before they butcher a creature, and then last day before they cook it. So therefore they're min-maxing how long that food lasts without a freezer. Now in our case, I don't think we have to worry about that. But the next thing to set up bill-wise is cooking some meals. Now I like to set up a cook simple meals until you have, and then I tend to times my colonists by about 3 to 5. So in this case I'm going to do 12. Then I'm going to come into details and add some details to it. I'm going to tell them, don't use vegetarian. I want to use meat first. So I'm going to set the top bill, because the top is the highest priority one, that you will only use meat to cook this type of simple meal until you have 12 of them, and then pause when satisfied and start cooking again when you get to about 50%, so 6. Then I can copy this and paste it down and then add it again with vegetarian. And then you need to have 10 food of any food type. So if they had 10 meat, they would go to this first one and they would cook it. If they only had 10 vegetarian, they would technically be using the second bill to cook it. Or if they had 5 meat and 5 vegetarian, they would use the second bill to use it. However, these are times 4 meals, so you actually need 40. And 40 of a meat or a veg, it doesn't necessarily add up. Say, for example, that the gazelles had 90 meat that they produce, which means you could do 2 lots of 40 to get 80, and then you'd be left with like 12 meat or 14 meat, which is a waste to just let it rot. So I always add an additional simple meal one, which they do until they have 12, but it's single meals. In fact, what I usually do is I set this lower so that they really don't worry about it unless we're really running low on food. It's, yeah, that way they don't spend forever just like kind of going back and forwards and creating food when it's not needed. And you can see now that our wind has stopped to an absolute minimum. So this is only producing 92 watts. This requires 350 watts to be powered, so it won't do anything. But what we can do is we can also add a light to make in here a little bit more pleasant. Yeah, get that nice and lit. So now we have shelter, we have food, we have a food source kind of growing now, and we also have wildlife that we can hunt. I may even send someone to go and hunt a few gazelles so you can see that happen. Another good idea to set up in the early game is again, get your fertile grid set on and kind of just build out another little grow zone and start growing some heal root. This means you'll have some medicine ready for when we have raids and things. And now this is when we've got kind of the real basics set up. I would recommend creating some sort of security measure. And there are a few security measures we can go through. Most basic, you come down to security and you create a barricade. I recommend usually from wood because it's usually, again, like a renewable resource. But in this case, I'm going to make it from steel because I'm out of wood. And you do just like a 3x3 by 3, and then you do another one down here. So I did this one slightly larger, I think. Oh no, I did the same size. And that means if we get a raid come in from this top area, we have some cover that our colonists can go into to shoot at them from. And if they come from this area, we have some cover for them to shoot at them from. Now, bearing in mind, this is like 50% cover, and it's useful, very, very useful, but you can still be shot, and your raiders can hide behind trees to shoot at you, and therefore just get almost as much cover. Not as much, but, you know, it still could mean that you're having a shootout. So another effective thing to consider is doing a mini trap situation. And I can show you what I mean by that. And I will be doing a future video which is much more in depth on how to survive raids and how to set up kill boxes and things like that. Oh, we have some chunks of spacecraft. This stuff, by the way, is really useful. When you deconstruct it, you will get components and steel, which is always good to have. So I'm going to chop down some wood so we have some wood, and set the time going faster because we're all sleeping. But you don't really want to be shot at, you don't really want to be attacked at all, so if you can avoid that by creating clever security methods, then you definitely want to do that. In the early game, the raid AI basically takes the path of least resistance to harm your colonists or harm your base. So if you can coax them through a trap to do one of those two actions, then you want to do it. Now later on, things get more complex where they may be sappers, which basically means they will just go through the path of least resistance to get to a bedroom to destroy it, or get to you to destroy you. You could get drop pod raids, which could just land anywhere, but in the early game you don't have to worry about that. So I'm going to utilize this as an example, but if I build around this like so, leaving myself with a 2 gap at the front there, and bugger, I wanted to put in a door before I did that. By the way, use wood doors. Wood doors are faster opening than any other type of door, and although they are flammable, the efficiency of them opening faster is just better, especially when you're trying to run away from something. They'll open and close much quicker. don't use stone for beds because stone is uncomfortable for beds, and ideally don't use steel for anything unless it's required, so I kind of broke that rule already. You also want to replace your wood walls as fast as you can with stone walls when you get the materials available to you. So I have 10 slate here that I could replace some of these walls with, but I'm not going to in this case. But yeah, so set up something like this, a little like C with this open front, and then kind of build this down about 9, maybe 10, and then build like this. What happens here is the raiders will come in and they'll go, oh, we have an easy path to get to you. So when a raid happens, draft your colonists, set them up in here, and what happens is the raids will come in and go, oh, there's an easy path in to them, and they'll run in here and run down here, and you will have a clear shot of them, and they won't really have anywhere to hide. But also, especially if they're melee, they have to run all the way down that, and you get shots at them the entire way down. But also, what we can do is we can add a spike trap, and we can add the spike trap. You can't put them next to each other. They have to go at least one space away, so I can't put it anywhere around it, but I can place them down like so. And then, so you're probably wondering, why don't they just go down this way? Well, the reason why we do it like this is because we can set up a fence, and the fence goes here, 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 and here, and the raider will now come down here and they're not smart, so they get forced over the traps, whereas your colonists, the fence belongs to them, so they stand on the fence to repair the traps so they don't in turn hurt themselves. That prevents you having to put doors all the way along. It used to be before we had fences, the best way to do it would be to have doors every single trap or every other trap, so you could go in and like repair them without risking your colonist. But yeah, this is a very basic kill box, and you would stand here and shoot at your colonist coming down. The sort of next upgrade on that is actually, sorry, not kill box really, like a trap run. The next sort of upgrade to that would be an actual kill box, and to do that you would want to wall your base. In this way I've accidentally kind of built out this way, and really I should have built over this way, but say like I'll show you in plans. I would build a wall like here. This is where we want the kill box. There could be a number of reasons you would want it. You basically want enough space that you can shoot at them over a long distance. You can add traps, you can add turrets, and give yourself enough space. But so this isn't the perfect kill box, but just to give you a rough idea, it would go in somewhere here, and then I would build a nice long alleyway. You would set up some cover here, some turrets all along here, and then you would potentially zigzag them in so they only had like one gap to get through like this, and all the way along here you'd have trap all the way around, so they come around here and they get trapped a lot, and if they get into here then this is suddenly just a kill box where you have turrets and all your colonists aiming at them. And because raiders aren't smart, they will take this one because it's the path of least resistance. The only reason they would attack through a wall is if they're a sapper raid, which you don't get until later. You might get a drop pod raid that just lands within your walls, so you need to be prepared for that as well, and I'll go into detail on how to prepare for those things in later videos. But this is some basic cover, basic security setup that you can have. We now have some food, we have shelter, we have power. This is pretty much setting you up for full success in the early game. There's not much more to the early game than just being disprepared. You'll want to start researching now, so I recommend doing batteries early. That's usually my go-to, but you could potentially, depending on your scenario, need something else. And yeah, just kind of build it from here. Hopefully this gives you a good starting point for your colony. If there's anything you think I missed out, please let me know in the comments below. If there's anything you would like me to do a tutorial on sooner rather than later, also please let me in the comments below. But hopefully you found this useful, and I'll see you on the next one.